The morning of Rowan Mercer's wedding, the sky above Iron Hollow was the color of old pewter, low and close, like the land itself was holding its breath. She stood in the back room of the Frontier Chapel, a narrow, drafty space that smelled of pine resin and wood rot, and stared at her own reflection in a piece of polished tin nailed crookedly to the wall. The dress she wore had belonged to someone else, a cousin, maybe, or a neighbor's daughter who had married better and moved on. Whoever she had been built differently than Rowan. The bodice pinched across the chest and pulled tight around her hips and waist in a way that made it hard to take a full breath. Her mother had spent the better part of the morning working extra panels of mismatched fabric into the seams, sewing quietly and quickly, not meeting Rowan's eyes the whole time. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much left to say. Outside the thin wall, Rowan could hear people settling into the pews, the low rumble of voices, the scrape of boots on wood floors, the occasional laugh quickly smothered. Iron Hollow was not a large town. There were maybe 200 people who called it home, if you counted the homesteaders scattered across the surrounding valley and the handful of families tucked up into the foothills. On a normal Sunday, the chapel drew perhaps 60 or 70 of them. But today was not a normal Sunday, and Rowan could tell by the sound of it that the building was filling past its usual capacity. They had come to see the spectacle. She understood that without being told. Her mother finished the last stitch, bit the thread with her teeth, and smoothed her hands down the back of the altered dress with a kind of forced tenderness that Rowan recognized. It was the gesture of a woman trying very hard not to show how much she was grieving. "There," her mother said softly. "It'll hold." Rowan said nothing. She looked at her reflection again, at the flush in her cheeks, the way the tight fabric defined her body in ways she would have given anything to hide, the hair her mother had pinned back with small wooden combs that kept threatening to slip loose. She had never been considered beautiful by Iron Hollow's standards. She knew that. She had known it since she was 12 years old and overheard two older girls at the general store talking about her in the way that girls sometimes do, not with cruelty exactly, but with a casual certainty that was somehow worse. She'd be pretty enough if she weren't so heavy. Said like a fact of weather. Said like it couldn't be helped. She had carried those words for 7 years. She carried them still. "Mama," Rowan said. "Don't." Her mother's voice was quick and soft, the kind that meant she was close to breaking and couldn't afford it. "Don't say anything right now. Just breathe." So Rowan breathed. In through her nose, out through her mouth, shallow because the dress didn't allow for more. She thought about her father, who was not here, who had not been right in the head since the bank came for the livestock 2 winters ago, and who now spent most of his days sitting in a chair by the window of their farmhouse, watching the empty fields with the blank patience of a man who had simply stopped expecting anything. She thought about her 2 younger brothers, thin-armed and wide-eyed and frightened in the way children get when they understand that something is very wrong but cannot name it. She thought about the debt, the specific, devastating weight of it, the numbers her mother had written in a small ledger book with a shaking hand, the letters that had arrived with the bank's seal pressed into red wax. $2,200. That was what the farm owed. That was what could not be paid. And then, 3 weeks ago, a man named Elias Dowd had knocked on their door. Rowan had not been in the room for that conversation. She had been in the kitchen, and the voices had been low, but the farmhouse was small, and she had heard enough. Dowd was a broker, the polite word, a man who made his living connecting people who had things to offer with people who had problems that needed solving. He had heard about the Mercer debt. He knew a man, he said, a rancher out on the north end of the valley, Cassian Blackwood, who had land and money and was of a marrying age but hadn't found a suitable woman on his own. There could be an arrangement, Dowd said, something that worked for everyone. Her mother had gone very quiet after that, and then she had said yes. Rowan had not screamed, she had not thrown anything, had not run, had not made any of the scenes she later imagined herself making. She had stood at the kitchen window with her hands flat on the wooden counter, staring at the bare trees at the edge of the property, and she had simply felt the bottom drop out of her life. 3 weeks later, here she was, in a dress that didn't fit, in a chapel full of people who had come to watch. There was a soft knock at the door, and her Uncle Birch put his head in. The one who would walk her down the aisle, since her father could not. He was a weathered, quiet man with a handlebar mustache and eyes that were kind and sorry at the same time. "It's time," he said. Rowan looked at her mother one more time. Her mother nodded, jaw tight, eyes bright with something she was refusing to let fall. Rowan picked up the small bundle of dried wildflowers someone had tied together for her. She didn't know who, they had been left on the table, and she walked to the door. The chapel went quieter when she appeared at the entrance. Not silent. There was still the shifting of bodies, the clearing of throats, but the particular noise of a crowd that has found what it was looking for. Rowan felt every eye in the building the moment she stepped into the aisle. She felt them on her face and her arms and the places where the dress pulled tight. She had spent years learning to move through the world in a way that made her smaller, that kept her to the edges of rooms, that gave other people as little to look at as possible. But there was nothing small about this moment. The aisle was narrow and the pews were close on both sides, and every face was turned toward her like flowers towards sun, except there was nothing warm in it. She kept her eyes forward. At the far end of the chapel stood Cassian Blackwood. She had seen him once before, briefly, across the street outside the land office about a year ago. She hadn't known who he was then, just a tall man in a dark coat, broad through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of someone who didn't feel the need to fill space with movement. She had noticed him the way you notice something out of place, and then she had walked on and forgotten about it. Now she looked at him properly for the first time. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was the way he stood, straight, with a kind of unselfconscious solidity, like a man who had never once wondered whether he was taking up too much room. His hair was dark and cut close at the sides, longer on top, and his face was angular in a way that made him look older than whatever age he actually was. He was clean-shaven. His jaw was set. He was watching her come toward him with an expression she could not read. Not cold, not warm, not pitying, just watchful. She hated that she couldn't read it. Her uncle released her arm at the front of the chapel, and Rowan stepped up beside Cassian Blackwood and stood as straight as the dress would allow. She did not look at him. She looked at the preacher, a thin man named Aldous Crane, who had a habit of speaking too fast when he was nervous. And she listened to words she wasn't really hearing, and she said the things she was supposed to say when it was time to say them. And she did not cry, which was the only thing she had been absolutely certain about from the beginning. She would not cry in front of these people. Not once. When it was over and Crane said it was finished, Rowan was aware of a scattering of polite applause from the pews, the kind people offered at occasions like this when they were not sure whether congratulations were the right thing. She heard the rustle of people rising, the conversations beginning again, no longer held in check. And then she was certain she heard because the woman was not more than 10 feet away and had misjudged how much the room had quieted, a voice say to another voice, low and amused, "Dowd must have been desperate. That's the best he could find for Blackwood?" A soft, stifled laugh. Rowan's face went very still. She did not turn around. She had learned over many years that turning around only gave them the satisfaction of watching what the words did to you. Cassian Blackwood, standing 2 feet to her left, went still in a different way. Not rigid, just stopped. The way a man stops when something has caught his attention that he wasn't prepared for. He glanced down at her quickly. She didn't meet his eyes. "Let's go," he said quietly. Just that. They walked out of the chapel together into the pewter-colored morning. The wagon that took them north out of Iron Hollow was loaded with the 2 trunks that contained everything Rowan owned in the world. Her mother had helped her pack them the night before, and there had been a careful, terrible efficiency to it. Sorting through the objects of a life the way you sorted through the aftermath of something, deciding what was worth carrying forward and what could be left behind. Cassian drove. Rowan sat beside him on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, watching the country open up as they left the town behind. The valley was wide here, ringed on the north and west by low hills, and in the winter it had a stripped, honest kind of beauty that she had always appreciated even when she had no language for it. The way the pale grass moved in the wind, the silver shine of ice along the creek beds, the dark lines of fence posts stretching away into the distance. They did not speak for the first several miles. The silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was also not hostile. It was the silence of 2 strangers who had agreed, by accident or design, that they would not fill it with noise just because noise was expected. Finally, without looking at him, Rowan said, "You don't have to be kind to me." He didn't answer immediately. The horses' hooves were steady and rhythmic on the frozen ground, and somewhere above them a hawk was quartering the pale sky. I wasn't planning to be kind or unkind, Cassian said. I was planning to be fair. Rowan turned that over. That's a different thing. Yes, he agreed. It is. Another silence, longer this time. The ranch, she said. What does it require of me? He glanced at her sideways briefly. At the moment, very little that I can't manage on my own, but there's a lot of territory. Fencing needs work in the spring. The house needs attention. I've been managing it alone for 2 years, and I'm better with cattle than with houses. There's cooking, if you're willing. A vegetable garden come April. In the fall, there's preserving and canning, more than one person can reasonably do alone. A pause. None of it is work I'd force on you. You can force whatever you like, Rowan said, before she could stop herself. That was the arrangement. It came out harder than she intended. She heard it land. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said carefully, That's not how I understand the arrangement. How do you understand it? As something we both walked into, he said, whatever the circumstances were. Rowan stared at the road ahead. A cloud moved across the weak sun, and the light shifted to something grayer and colder. And if I told you, she said slowly, that the circumstances for me were not ones I chose? He didn't answer right away. She felt him thinking about it. Then I'd say, he said finally, that I'm sorry to hear that, and that whatever happened before this morning is not something I can fix, but I can tell you what I intend, if that's worth anything. What do you intend? Not to make it worse, he said simply. She didn't know what to do with that. She had been prepared for indifference, for condescension, for the particular kind of contempt that men sometimes directed at women they felt they had purchased, even when they dressed it up as something else. She had not been prepared for this particular plainness, this absence of pretense. It unsteadied her in a way she didn't like. All right, she said at last. All right, he repeated. They drove the rest of the way in that same careful quiet, and when Blackwood Ranch came into view, a cluster of buildings set against the low hills, solid and weathered, smoke rising from the main chimney. Rowan looked at it the way you look at a place you know you are going to have to figure out, and she felt something she did not yet have a name for. Not hope, exactly. Something more cautious than that, something that had not quite been extinguished. The house was larger than she expected and messier than she had been prepared for. Not dirty in a way that suggested neglect, so much as a way that suggested a man who had been very busy for a very long time and had simply run out of hours. The kitchen table had papers on it, what looked like livestock records and supply lists. The shelves above the fireplace held a row of mismatched books spine out beside a collection of objects that made no obvious sense together. A broken compass, 3 flat river stones, an empty tobacco tin. The floors were swept, but the corners had been missed. The windows were clean, but the curtains, where there were curtains, had not been straightened in months. The 2 hired hands who worked the ranch, a wiry, cheerful man of about 40, named Gus, and a younger, quieter one called Peter, who spoke very little but seemed to see everything, carried her trunks inside and set them at the foot of the stairs with a diffident courtesy that surprised her. Gus offered his congratulations with such genuine warmth that she almost believed he meant it. Peter nodded once and went back outside. Cassian showed her through the downstairs, opening doors and naming rooms without ceremony, and then showed her up the stairs to a bedroom that he had clearly spent some effort preparing. There were fresh sheets on the bed, a rag rug on the floor that looked recently beaten, a washstand with a clean towel folded over the bar. A small window looked out over the back pasture. "You can have this room," he said. "I'm across the hall." She looked at him. "I said what I intended," he said, without any particular emphasis. "I meant it." She nodded. She set her small bag on the bed and stood in the middle of the room and looked out the window at the pasture and the hills beyond, and she tried to understand what her life had just become. The first week was an exercise in careful navigation. Rowan did not know how to be in this house. She understood the mechanics of it. She had kept house for her family since she was 14, had cooked and cleaned and managed stores and mended, all of it. But the social mechanics were foreign to her. How much space did she take up? What was hers to decide and what was his? When he sat at the head of the table for supper and she set the plates and they ate together in the kitchen's warm lamplight, what exactly were they performing? Husband and wife? Landlord and tenant? Two strangers sharing a roof by mutual agreement? She thought it was probably the last one, which was why it bothered her when it started feeling like something else. Cassian Blackwood was not an easy man to dislike. She had tried in the way you try for something you know you need in order to survive. She had gone looking for the cruelty she expected, the condescension, the small daily humiliations. She found none of them. He did not comment on her appearance. He did not remark on what she ate or how much. When she was slow to find something in the kitchen because she did not yet know where everything lived, he showed her without impatience. When she made his coffee wrong, too weak by half, she had not known he preferred it strong. He drank it without complaint and only mentioned it the next time offhandedly, the way you mention a preference and not a failing. She caught him watching her sometimes, but it was not the kind of watching she was used to. It was not appraisal. It was not the searching look that waited for her to confirm what it already believed about her. It was something more like attention, the particular alert focus of a person who is paying genuine notice to another person. It made her profoundly uncomfortable. "You're watching me again," she said one evening, without looking up from the sock she was darning. They were in the sitting room, the fire going, the wind outside making the kind of sound against the eaves that meant another cold night coming. "Sorry," he said. She glanced up then. He was sitting across from her with a livestock record open in his lap, but his eyes had been on her and they both knew it. "What is it?" she said. He considered the question seriously, which was something she was learning was a habit of his. He did not answer things quickly unless he had already thought about them. "I'm trying to figure you out," he said. "I keep thinking I have a read on you and then you do something that doesn't fit." "Like what?" "This morning," he said. "When Gus told you what he'd found in the east pasture, the fox that got into the hen run, you were upset. Not angry at the fox, upset. That's not common." Rowan set down her darning needle. "Gus shot it," she said. "It was necessary. I understand that. But the fox was just being a fox." "Yes," Cassian said. "That's what I mean." She looked at him for a moment, genuinely uncertain what he was getting at. Then she picked up the needle again and didn't ask. But that night, lying in the small bedroom with the rag rug under her feet and the wind pushing against the window glass, she caught herself thinking about that look on his face. Not the content of what he'd said exactly, but the quality of his attention, the sense of a person genuinely interested in understanding something. She had not experienced that in a very long time. She was not sure she trusted it. She was not sure she was wrong not to trust it. She turned onto her side and stared at the wall and told herself firmly that it did not matter. She was here for survival. She was here because there had been no other door. She would do what was necessary. She would manage what had to be managed. And she would not make the mistake of confusing a man's decency for anything more than that. She was 19 years old, and she had no illusions left. She would not manufacture new ones. The town came to her before she was ready. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, a woman named Harriet Voss arrived at the door with a covered dish and the particular brightness of someone who has come under the guise of welcome, but with the actual purpose of assessment. She was perhaps 45, well-dressed by Iron Hollow standards, with small pale eyes that moved around the interior of the house, even as her mouth made pleasant conversation. Rowan stood at the door in her working clothes. She had been in the root cellar taking inventory when she heard the knock, and she could see the calculation happening behind Harriet Voss's eyes. The taking stock. "We've been meaning to visit," Harriet said, handing over the dish, a dried apple cake, heavy and fragrant. "The women of Iron Hollow like to make sure our new wives are settling in properly." Our wives. As though Rowan belonged to the town in some way, as though she had been placed there by them. "Thank you," Rowan said, taking the dish. "That's very kind. You must find it lonely, all the way out here," Harriet continued, her eyes drifting past Rowan into the house behind her. "Without family nearby." "I keep busy," Rowan said. "Yes, I'm sure." Harriet's gaze came back to her, dropped briefly and unmistakably to the fitted line of her bodice, and then went back to her face with a small, composed smile. Cassian must be glad to have help around the property, a ranch this size. The word help was chosen with precision. Rowan understood its weight. not wife, not partner. Help. He is, Rowan said pleasantly, and I'm glad to be here. It wasn't entirely a lie. That surprised her a little. After Harriet left, Rowan stood in the kitchen with the apple cake in her hands and felt the shape of what she had just navigated. The conversation had been a test, as all of Harriet Voss's conversations were probably tests, and Rowan was not certain whether she had passed it or failed it, or whether the test had been designed to have no passing grade. She set the cake on the counter and went back to the root cellar. Cassian came in at supper with the smell of cold air and horses on him, and when he saw the dish on the counter, he raised an eyebrow. "Harriet Voss," Rowan said. "Ah," he said, as though that explained something. "She came to look at the house," Rowan said. "And me." He poured himself water from the pitcher and leaned against the counter. "What did you think of her?" "I think she's used to knowing things before other people do," Rowan said. "And she doesn't like when she doesn't." He looked at her with that measuring attention again, and she caught the edge of something that might have been a smile. Not yet there, but somewhere just behind his face. "That's accurate," he said. They ate supper. The apple cake was good, which irritated Rowan in a way she couldn't fully explain. The cold deepened toward the end of November, and life at the ranch settled into a rhythm she hadn't anticipated finding. The mornings were early. She was up before the sun, which in winter came late and grudging, laying the fire and starting breakfast before Cassian and the hands came in from the first chores. She had taken over the kitchen entirely, which was both practical and necessary, and she found, though she would not have admitted it, that she was glad of it. The kitchen was hers to manage. It was a small sovereignty, but she had learned to value small things. She made mistakes. She burned a pot of beans because she set it too close to the fire and got distracted by the wind making a strange sound she wanted to identify. She planted her boot in a patch of ice near the well and went down hard on one knee and limped for 2 days and refused to make anything of it. She mixed up the grain stores in the barn once, which Gus corrected with tact and Peter pretended not to notice. Cassian noticed all of it and said nothing. When she burned the beans, he helped her haul the ruined pot outside, and they both stood in the cold looking at it, and she said, too flatly, "I'll do better tomorrow." And he said, "The beans weren't the only thing that could have been done differently, to be honest. That pot runs too hot on the left side. I should have warned you." And they went back inside. She thought about that for days, the small grace of it. In the evenings, when supper was cleared and the hands had gone to their quarters, and the fire was banked and the house was quiet, they sometimes talked. Not always. Sometimes they sat on opposite sides of the sitting room and he read or went over his records and she sewed or wrote letters she was not sure she would send. But sometimes one of them said something small and unguarded, the kind of thing you say when your defenses have gone down in the dark. And it opened into a conversation neither of them had planned. She learned that he had taken over the ranch at 22 when his father died of a fever, and that he had spent 3 years getting it into a condition he could be proud of. She learned that he had no siblings, and that his mother had gone back east years ago, and that he was not in contact with her, in a way that suggested the not being in contact was deliberate, but that he had made his peace with it. He learned that she had been reading since she was 6, and that she had once, briefly, thought she might teach school. He learned that she could identify most of the region's native plants by sight, and that she had names for the 2 horses she liked best, names she had not told anyone. He did not ask for more than she offered. She did not volunteer more than she intended to. But somewhere in those cold November evenings, between the fire's warmth and the wind's steady pressure against the walls of the house, Rowan Mercer, who had come to Blackwood Ranch expecting to endure, began instead to simply be there, to inhabit the kitchen and the root cellar and the back pasture on clear mornings with the frost still white on the grass, to exist in this place without apology, without constant bracing. She did not trust it. She kept waiting for the thing that would undo it, the cruelty she had been expecting, the contempt she had been prepared for. It did not come. And the not coming of it was its own kind of unsettling, because she did not know how to understand a world that was simply decent to her. She was still figuring that out when December arrived, and with it, the church gathering that changed everything. It was the first one she had attended as Cassian's wife. He had not insisted. He had told her, 2 weeks in, that he went to the monthly gatherings because it was necessary for a man in his position to be present in town, but that she was not obligated to come along unless she wanted to. She had thought about it for a long time and decided that not going was its own kind of surrender, and that she was done surrendering before she'd even started. She wore her best dress. It was not the borrowed one that had gone back, but the dark blue wool she had brought in one of her trunks, the one that fit her properly, that she had made herself 2 winters ago when she had still cared about such things. She looked at herself in the tin mirror before they left and thought, "This is what I look like. This is me." Not as a judgment, just as a fact. The gathering was held in the chapel's main room after a short service, and it was the social event of the month. The women brought food, the men stood in clusters near the door, the children ran between everyone's feet in ways their parents pretended not to notice. Rowan stayed near Cassian at first, which was easier, but he was drawn into conversation with 2 other ranchers about fencing regulations, and she found herself standing at the long table with the food on it, pouring herself a cup of cider. That was when they came to her. There were 4 of them, and she knew 2 of them by name, Harriet Voss, who she had already met, and a younger woman called Delia Marsh, who was married to the man who ran the dry goods store. The other 2 she did not know. They were all smiling, which was always the first warning. "Rowan," Harriet said warmly, "how lovely that you've come." "It is," Rowan agreed, holding her cup with both hands. "We were just saying," Delia said, glancing at the others in a way that was meant to look casual, "how fortunate Cassian is to have found someone to help him manage the ranch." "Help." Again. "I'm sure you would say the same of your own husband," Rowan said evenly. "Managing a household is its own kind of work." Delia's smile tightened at the edges. "Of course. Although not every woman has the same—" She paused, tilting her head slightly. "Opportunities as others." Rowan looked at her, directly, steadily, in a way she had learned to do over years of being looked at and found wanting. The counter gaze that made the other person understand their scrutiny had been seen and named. "I'm not sure I know what you mean," she said. Delia knew she knew. Both of them knew it. That was the game. "Only that you came to Iron Hollow rather suddenly," Delia said. "And that poor Cassian, well, he was lonely. Men get lonely, and brokers, they find solutions." She smiled warmly, as though she had said something generous. There was a beat of silence. The 2 women Rowan didn't know were watching with bright eyes. "Dowd is a practical man," Harriet added, with the air of someone contributing something useful. "He found a match that worked for everyone's circumstances." Circumstances. The debt, her body, her lack of choices. All of it wrapped in that one careful, devastating word. Rowan felt the heat move through her, the old familiar shame rising like a tide. She felt the pressure behind her eyes that had nothing to do with tears. It was the pressure of years of this, of being measured against a standard she had never been told she was failing until she had already failed it. And then something happened that she had not planned and could not have predicted. She opened her mouth and did not lower her eyes. She looked at Harriet Voss and Delia Marsh and the 2 women whose names she didn't know, and she said, calmly, clearly, in a voice that carried, "My family lost everything. That's true. The farm went under, the debt came due, and there were no good choices left. I didn't pick that. Nobody picks that." The table had gone quiet. The noise around them had not stopped, but the immediate radius had gone still in the way it does when people sense a confrontation and don't want to miss it. "I walked down that aisle knowing the whole town had come to watch," Rowan continued. "I heard what was said. I've been hearing versions of it my whole life, that I'm too much of something, too heavy, too plain, too poor, too inconvenient to deserve what other women seem to come by without thinking." She kept her voice level. She did not raise it. She had learned that you did not need to raise your voice to make someone hear you. "You came here to be kind at me, which is its own kind of cruelty, and I want you to know I understand exactly what it is." Delia's smile had gone entirely. Harriet was very still. "I didn't ask for pity," Rowan said. "I didn't ask for your assessment of my circumstances or your calculation of what I'm worth to any man. I asked for a cup of cider and a quiet evening with my husband." She picked up her cup. "So if you'll excuse me," she said, and she turned and walked away across the room with her back straight and her chin level, and she did not look to see what their faces were doing. Her hands were shaking, and she held the cup very carefully so no one could tell. Rowan made it to the far wall before her legs decided they were done cooperating. She found a chair near the window, one of the straight-backed wooden ones that lined the chapel wall like forgotten sentinels, and she sat down with the care of someone who does not trust their own body at the moment, and she stared at the cup of cider in her hands and waited for the shaking to stop. It took longer than she would have liked. Around her, the gathering had resumed its ordinary noise. Conversations restarted, children chased each other between adults' legs. Someone near the food table laughed at something too loudly. Whether the scene with Harriet Voss and Delia Marsh had been witnessed by anyone beyond their immediate circle, Rowan couldn't tell without looking around, and she was not going to look around. She kept her eyes on the window, on the dark glass that showed her a dim reflection of the room, and beyond it, nothing, just the black winter night outside. She had not planned to say any of that. She wanted to be clear with herself about that fact. It had not been a calculated decision, not a moment of carefully gathered courage. It had been something more involuntary than courage, more like the way a person throws their hands out when they're falling. Reflex. The body deciding before the mind could weigh in. And now she was sitting in this chair with shaking hands, and she did not know whether what she had done was brave or simply reckless. A shadow moved to her left and she tensed, expecting Harriet or Delia or one of the other two, expecting a second round delivered more quietly, the kind that came after the audience had dispersed. But when she looked up, it was Cassian, standing with a plate of food in one hand and his coat over the other arm, looking at her with an expression that was hard to name. Gus heard what happened, he said quietly, from across the room. She felt her stomach drop. Gus was watching? Gus watches everything. He has opinions about it too, but I told him to keep them. Cassian pulled the chair beside her away from the wall and sat down without asking whether she wanted company, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said, which was mostly not true but was also not entirely a lie. He looked at her for a moment. You don't have to be fine. I'm aware, she said. I'm choosing it anyway. He nodded slowly, accepting that. He set the plate on his knee, bread, cheese, a slice of cold ham, and ate without comment, without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. And she sat beside him, and gradually the shaking in her hands subsided, and the heat in her chest settled to something she could manage. After a while, he said, still not looking at her, Harriet Voss has opinions about things that aren't her business. She always has. Most people here find it easier to agree with her than argue. I noticed, Rowan said. What you said to her, he said carefully, was heard by more people than you might think. She looked at him. His face was still turned toward the room, watching it with that level, unreadable steadiness she had come to recognize as his default setting when he was in public. Is that a problem? She asked. He turned to look at her then, directly, in that way he had of giving his full attention when he meant something. No, he said. It's not. She studied his face for a moment, sort of looking for the reservation behind the word, the qualification that would come in softer form. She did not find one. Either he meant what he said, or he was better at concealing things than she had given him credit for. She was beginning to suspect with some discomfort that it was the former. They did not stay long after that. The ride home through the cold dark was quiet, but it was a different quiet than the silences of their first week. Less careful, less like two people measuring the distance between them. More like two people who had agreed, without discussing it, that they were tired, and that some silences were just silences. She cried that night. She had told herself she would not, had held it back through the chapel and the ride home and the process of unhooking her dress and sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark. And then it came anyway. The way things come when you have held them back too long. Not loud. She had learned very young to cry quietly, in the particular silence of a house where you did not want to be heard. She sat in the dark with her hands in her lap and let it move through her, and then it was done. It was not grief exactly. It was something more complicated. The release of something that had been pressed down for a very long time. The particular exhaustion of spending years braced against a world that kept swinging at you. She had stood up in that room and said true things out loud, and the world had not ended, and Harriet Voss had gone still and quiet, and Cassian had come to sit beside her with a plate of food, and said, You don't have to be fine. and all of that together was more than she had expected from this night, and the unexpectedness of it had undone something in her that she had not known was held together with wire. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and went to the washstand and cleaned up in the cold water, and then got into bed and lay there in the dark, listening to the wind, and eventually she slept. In the morning, she came downstairs and found Cassian already in the kitchen, the fire going, coffee on the stove. He was at the table with his records again, bent over a column of figures, and he looked up when she came in. "Coffee's ready," he said. "Thank you," she said, and poured it, and stood at the window with the cup in both hands and looked out at the back pasture in the early morning light. The frost was heavy today, every fence rail and blade of grass outlined in white, and the sky was clear for the first time in days. A pale, hard blue that promised cold, but at least not more snow. "I need to tell you something," Rowan said. He set down his pencil. She heard the small sound of it against the table. "I'm listening," he said. She kept her eyes on the pasture. It was easier to say things when she was not looking at him directly. She had noticed this about herself and was not proud of it, but she was done pretending to be stronger than she was for the sake of appearances. "When Dowd came to my mother," she said, "I was in the other room. I heard most of it. She agreed to the arrangement without asking me first." She paused. "I don't say that to condemn her. We were out of options, and she made the best choice she could see. But I want you to know that I walked into that chapel without having chosen it, without having been asked." The silence behind her was very still. "I thought you should know that," she said, "because I think you've been assuming something different, and it didn't seem right to let you keep assuming it." A long moment passed. She heard him push back his chair, heard him rise. She did not turn around. "Rowan," he said. She turned. He was standing beside the table with his arms loose at his sides and his face doing something she had not seen it do before. Not anger, not pity, something rawer than either. "I didn't know that," he said. "I know. Dowd told me—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Dowd told me both parties were willing, that it was a practical arrangement, but that you understood it and had agreed." "He lied," Rowan said simply. Cassian's jaw tightened. He turned away briefly to the window, and she watched the muscles in his shoulders work through something. When he turned back, his expression was controlled again, but just barely. "Why are you telling me now?" he asked. It was a fair question. She had thought about it for most of the night, had turned it over in the dark after the tears were done, had tried to understand her own reasons. "Because last night," she said carefully, "I stood up in front of those women and said that I deserved to be here. And I can't say that and then keep secrets from you. It doesn't hold together." He looked at her for a long time. Something moved across his face that she could not fully read, something complicated and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't." He picked up his coffee cup, then set it down without drinking from it. He was working something out. She let him. "I would have," he started, and then stopped. "If I had known what the situation actually was." He shook his head. "I don't know what I would have done differently. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." "I'm not asking you to do anything differently," Rowan said. "I'm just telling you what's true, because you've been decent to me and you deserve the truth." He looked at her. "Decent," he said, the word flat, like he was examining it. "Yes," she said. "Don't make a face at it. It's a compliment where I come from." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that it changed the room. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She turned back to the window and the frost-lined pasture and the hard blue sky and drank her coffee, and she heard him sit back down and pick up his pencil, and between them the air was different, lighter or maybe just less loaded. Something had been laid down that had been carried too long, and the floor had held it, and the world had not ended. She began to understand Blackwood Ranch from the inside out, the way you understand a place only when you stop being a visitor in it. The ranch ran about 400 acres, most of it grazing land for the cattle herd, with a stretch of creek-bottom timber to the east that Cassian used for firewood and occasional building material. The main house sat on a small rise with the barn and outbuildings downhill to the northwest, arranged in the practical geometry of a working property, everything positioned relative to everything else by logic rather than aesthetics. The vegetable beds behind the house had been dug and turned and left for winter, the dark soil frozen solid, waiting. Gus and Peter lived in a two-room bunkhouse at the edge of the yard. Gus cooked for himself, badly and cheerfully, and would appear at the back door of the main house on cold mornings with some flimsy pretense, a question about the feed schedule, a report on the fence line, clearly motivated by the smell of Rowan's biscuits. She started making extra without comment, and Gus ate them with the unselfconscious gratitude of a man who had been subsisting on his own cooking for too long. Peter never came to the door uninvited, but would accept a wrapped portion left on the bunkhouse step with a slight nod that communicated volumes. She liked them both. She had not expected to like anyone out here. "You know Gus will follow you around like a stray dog if you keep feeding him," Cassian said one morning, watching Gus amble back across the yard with a biscuit in each hand. "I know," Rowan said, watching through the window. "I don't mind." "He'll have opinions," Cassian said. "He has opinions about everything." "I've noticed. I have opinions too. We get along fine." Cassian looked at her with that sideways attention of his, the kind she was getting better at reading. Amused, she thought. Quietly, privately amused, in the way of a man who didn't laugh easily but appreciated something when it was worth appreciating. She did not make the mistake of pointing this out to him. The ranch's daily rhythms were demanding in a way she found she needed. Winter was the quiet season. No planting, no harvest. The cattle largely managed on hay and range grass under Gus and Peter's care. But there was still the constant maintenance of a working property, the small and not-so-small repairs and preparations that kept a place functional through the hard months. She did not know cattle the way Cassian and the hands knew cattle, but she knew how to keep a house running efficiently, and she applied the same practical instinct to everything she touched. She reorganized the pantry in the second week and did not tell Cassian she'd done it, just let him discover that he could find things without looking for them. He did not say anything about it, but she caught him in there one afternoon, slightly paused, with the look of a man who has found something in the right place when he had expected it to be in the wrong one. She fixed the curtains in the sitting room, the ones that had been hanging crooked since before she arrived. She mended 2 of the jackets that had been piled in the corner of the mudroom with tears along the seams, Cassian's work clothes, left there clearly because he had not got around to it and had no one to ask. She left them on the chair without mentioning it. He put them on the next day without mentioning it. That was a whole conversation, she thought, conducted entirely without words, and she was beginning to understand that this was one of the ways they communicated, through the small, practical acknowledgement of each other's presence. It was a different kind of language than she had learned at home, but she was picking it up. December turned bitter and settled in. The temperature dropped in a way that the valley residents described as normal, but that made Rowan understand viscerally, for the first time, what the frontier winters she had heard about actually meant. The cold was not just cold. It was a weight, a presence, a daily negotiation. You dressed in layers before you went out. You moved quickly between warmth and warmth. You made sure the firewood was stacked close and plentiful. You checked the water pipes first thing every morning and last thing every night. She stopped dreading the cold after the first week and started simply managing it, which was a different relationship with it and a more sustainable one. One evening in mid-December, a bad storm came through with very little warning. The sky turned the color of iron by mid-afternoon, and by dusk the snow was coming sideways, driven by wind that found every gap in the house's construction and whistled through it. Cassian and the hands had been out working on the east fence when it turned, and they came in together through the back door in a blast of cold and snow, half-frozen and loud, with the particular loud relief of men who have just come in from something bad. Rowan had seen it coming and had the fire built up high, and a pot of stew on the stove that had been meant for tomorrow, but which was ready tonight. Gus came in pulling off his gloves and said, with feeling, "Lord above, woman, I could kiss you," and then looked immediately mortified at his own enthusiasm. "Don't," Rowan said, "but sit down." She fed all 3 of them at the kitchen table, which was not the usual arrangement. Gus and Peter generally ate at the bunkhouse, but no one was going back out in this storm before it let up, and the kitchen was warm. It was a loud, crowded meal. Gus ate 2 bowls and told a long, disjointed story about a winter storm 3 years back that involved a mule named Beauregard who had opinions about weather. Peter ate carefully and said almost nothing but laughed once quickly. Through his nose, at something Gus said, which Rowan gathered was the equivalent of anyone else convulsing with laughter. Cassian ate and listened and occasionally contributed a word or two, and now and then his eyes moved to Rowan across the table in a way that she had learned to recognize and could not yet name. When the meal was done and the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse through the still howling storm, Rowan washed the dishes in the kitchen while Cassian dried and put them away, which was something they had arrived at gradually over the weeks without ever discussing it. The fire had burned down to a comfortable warmth, and outside the wind pushed against the house steadily, a low, constant pressure, like something leaning against the walls. "Thank you," Cassian said. "For tonight. The storm did the scheduling," she said. "Still." He set the last bowl on the shelf and turned to face her, leaning against the counter. You've made this place different, better. I want you to know I notice it." She rinsed the last pot and set it on the rack and dried her hands on the towel by the window. The compliment sat somewhere in her chest, and she did not know quite what to do with it. "Gus does most of the noticing," she said. "Gus notices everything edible," he said. "That's different." She almost smiled. She was almost certain he saw it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can try." He watched her for a moment. "That morning, after the gathering, when you told me about Dowd, why didn't you lead with that? When you first arrived? Why wait 3 weeks to say it?" She thought about it honestly. "Because I didn't know what you were. I didn't know if telling you would make things better or worse. I'd learned that telling people true things was sometimes not useful." He was quiet for a moment. "Who taught you that?" She looked at him directly. "A lot of people," she said, "starting when I was about 12. His face did something, quickly. A tightening she read as something between anger and recognition, the anger not directed at her. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'd rather know the truth even when it's inconvenient." "I'm starting to believe that," she said. "Only starting?" "I've been wrong before," she said. "I move carefully these days." He nodded slowly, accepting this. "Fair enough," he said. She folded the dish towel and hung it on its hook and moved toward the doorway, and then stopped because something had been sitting at the back of her mind for days, and she had not asked it because she had not been sure she wanted the answer. "Cassian," she said. He looked up. "Did you know what Dowd was before? What kind of man he was?" A pause. "I knew he was a broker," he said. "I knew how he worked. I told myself that didn't make the arrangement wrong if both people came to it honestly." He stopped. "I should have asked more questions." "Yes," she said. "I know." He said it simply, without argument. She nodded once and went upstairs, and she lay in the dark and listened to the storm push against the house, and she thought about the careful, difficult work of trusting a person. Not all at once, not on faith, but the small, daily way of it, the constant re-choosing. She thought about all the reasons she had not to, and she thought about all the small evidence she had been gathering over these weeks that she had not meant to gather. She was not ready to call it trust. She was not going to be reckless with herself like that, but she was willing to call it the beginning of something. That felt like enough. For a December night in a ranch house in Iron Hollow, with the storm pressing at the walls and the fire banked low downstairs, and a man across the hall who had said, "I'd rather know the truth even when it's inconvenient," and meant it. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind sang on. Christmas passed quietly. She wrote to her mother, a long, careful letter that said more between the lines than in the lines themselves, and she put money in the envelope, her first month's allowance, what Cassian had set aside for her household use, and sealed it before she could change her mind. She did not know if her mother would understand what the money meant. She hoped she would. Cassian gave her a book. He put it on the kitchen table Christmas morning without ceremony, wrapped in brown paper, her name written on it in his clear, slightly tilted hand. And when she looked up at him, he shrugged one shoulder as though daring her to make something of it. It was a collection of plant specimens from the region, a naturalist's catalog with careful illustrations and Latin names beside the common ones. She ran her fingers over the illustrations and felt something grip her throat that she refused to allow upward. "How did you know?" she asked. "I've seen you stop on the South Ridge 3 times to look at something in the grass," he said. "Whatever it is, you always look at it like it's worth looking at." She closed the book and held it against her chest and looked at him, and the grip in her throat tightened further, and she said, "Thank you," in a voice that was quieter than she intended, and he said, "You're welcome," in a voice that matched it, and they stood in the kitchen at a careful distance that felt both too far and too close. She gave him nothing because she had had nothing to give, and the guilt of that had been sitting heavy on her for a week. She told him so, straight out, because she was done pretending to be fine about things she was not fine about. "I couldn't get into town to buy anything," she said, "and I had nothing here I could—" "Rowan," he said. She stopped. "The house runs better than it has in years," he said. "Gus is half a pound heavier. The curtains are straight. That's enough." She looked at him for a long moment. "You have very low expectations," she said. He looked at her very steadily. "No," he said. "I don't." She did not ask what he meant. She went and put the book on the shelf in the sitting room where she could see it from the chair she had taken to sitting in, and she stood there for a moment looking at its spine, and she thought that this was the strangest life she had ever imagined for herself, and also that she was not, at this particular moment, sorry to be in it. January arrived with a hard freeze that locked the creek and made the cattle miserable and kept everyone close to the fire. Rowan spent the long indoor hours baking bread, mending, reading, working her way through Cassian's small collection of books, which turned out to be more varied than the shelf suggested. History, land surveys, a dog-eared almanac, 2 novels that had been read many times and showed it in their broken spines. She read one of the novels and left it on his side of the kitchen table with a note that said, "Only, page 47. What did you think?" She did not sign it because the handwriting was enough. He left the book back on her side that evening with a note on page 47 that said, "I thought she was right and too stubborn to say so, like most people." And below that, after a gap, "What did you think?" This became, slowly and without either of them naming it, a conversation that stretched across weeks, notes in books, observations passed at the breakfast table, the kind of small continuous dialogue that builds something between people without any single moment you can point to as the beginning. She thought of herself sometimes, in the first nights at the ranch, saying flatly that he didn't have to be kind to her. She thought of herself saying, "I'm choosing fine about something that was not, at the time, fine." She thought of the girl who had walked down that chapel aisle with her eyes forward and her hands clenched around a bundle of dried wildflowers and no road back. That girl was still her. The weight of those weeks had not disappeared, but something had been added to it, something she could not yet fully name, something that had to do with walking into a room that had been cold for a long time and finding unexpectedly that someone had already started the fire. She was not safe. She knew that. This was not a story about being safe. The town of Iron Hollow still had opinions, and those opinions had not gone away because she had said some true things at a gathering in December. Harriet Voss was still out there. Delia Marsh was still out there. The world that had judged her since she was 12 years old was still, as far as she could tell, the world. But here, on this ridge, in this cold-floored house with the frost on the windows and the books on the shelf, and the man across the hall who said, "I'd rather know the truth," and "No, I don't have low expectations." Here she was something different than what that world had decided she was. She was not sure yet what that something was. She was still figuring it out, day by careful day, in the space between who she had been and who she might yet become. Outside, January held the valley in its fist and did not let go. And inside Blackwood Ranch, quiet and imperfect, and nothing like what she had expected, Rowan Mercer kept the fire burning and waited to understand what she was waiting for. February came in quietly, which should have been a warning. The hard freeze of January broke in the second week of the month, replaced by a milder cold that felt almost generous by comparison. Days where the sun actually reached the ground and stayed there for a few hours, where the frost on the window glass melted by mid-morning and left the panes clear enough to see the pasture without wiping. Rowan took it as a gift and did not examine it too closely. She had learned that in Iron Hollow, gifts from the weather were usually temporary. The ranch was busy in a different way than January had been. The milder temperatures meant the cattle could range further, which meant more fence work, which meant Cassian and the hands were out longer each day. Gus developed a cough that he insisted was nothing and that kept him up nights, and Peter took on extra chores without comment while Gus recovered, which told Rowan everything she needed to know about the quiet man's character. She made broth and left it at the bunkhouse door, and Gus drank it and said it was the best medicine he'd ever had, and Peter nodded once, which Rowan had come to understand meant thank you. And I agree, and possibly you are all right, all at the same time. The days had a shape to them now that she recognized as hers. Morning fire, breakfast, the particular rhythm of chores that she had made her own over 2.5 months. She knew which floorboard near the pantry door would stick in the cold and how to step around it. She knew that the cast iron skillet needed 5 minutes on the heat before it was ready, not 3, and that the chimney in the sitting room drew better if the damper was set at 3/4 open rather than full. She knew the sound the back gate made in the wind, a particular uneven clank, and could distinguish it from the sound it made when someone was actually opening it. She was learning the ranch the way you learn a language, slowly, then all at once. And she was learning Cassian Blackwood in the same way, which was something she had not planned and did not quite know what to do with. He was not an easy man to know. That was the thing about him. There was no performance to him, no layer of social pleasantry that you could read while the real person stayed safely behind it. What you got from Cassian was what was there, which meant you had to pay close attention because he did not repeat himself or amplify for effect. He said things once, clearly, and then waited to see what you did with them. It was a quality she found alternately refreshing and unsettling, sometimes both in the same conversation. She noticed things about him that she filed away without examining too closely. That he was easier in the evenings than the mornings. That he could be in a room with a problem, a piece of equipment that wasn't working, a ledger that wouldn't balance, and give it a quality of sustained focus that most people couldn't sustain for 10 minutes. That he read the way she did, going back over passages, pausing, which she knew because she saw where his thumb had worn the margins of his books. That he had a habit, when he was thinking hard about something, of pressing 2 fingers against his lower jaw and going very still. She noticed these things and then put them away and went back to work. The book exchange had continued through January and into February. It had evolved from occasional notes to something more like a running conversation. She would annotate the margins in light pencil. He would respond. She had been careful at first, saying only safe things, observations about plot or character that carried no personal weight. But somewhere in the middle of a novel she'd found behind the almanac, a battered thing with no cover, probably someone's discarded copy. She had written in the margin beside a passage about a woman making a terrible choice. She knew it was wrong and did it anyway. That's the most honest thing in this book. And he had written back below it, "Most honest thing I've read in a while. You know exactly what you mean even when I don't know how to." She had read that 3 times. Then she had closed the book and put it back on the shelf and not opened it again for a week. The second church gathering of the year was announced on a Sunday in mid-February, set for the following weekend. Rowan heard about it when Gus mentioned it over breakfast, the way he mentioned most things, tangentially, between other subjects, in a way that was probably deliberate. She said nothing at the time. Later that morning, when Cassian came in from the barn, she told him she would go. He looked at her with a careful neutrality that she had come to recognize as the face he made when he was choosing his words. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going." A pause. "All right," he said. "We'll go together." She nodded and went back to the bread dough she was working on the counter, and he poured himself coffee and sat down with his records, and that was the whole conversation. But she noticed that he did not argue, did not try to manage her decision, did not suggest that perhaps staying home was the wiser choice given what had happened in December. She noticed, and she added it to the accumulation of small evidence she had been gathering. The next several days she caught herself thinking about the gathering more than she wanted to. Not with dread exactly. It was something more complicated than dread. More like the feeling before a confrontation you have already decided to walk into, where the anticipation is its own kind of work. She knew that Harriet Voss would be there. She knew that Delia Marsh would be there. She knew what December had cost her in terms of whatever thin social tolerance Iron Hollow had extended toward Cassian's unexpected wife. And she knew the gathering would be the first time she had faced that room since. She made a dress. Not from scratch. She did not have the materials or the time. But she took the dark blue wool and added a panel at the waist that she had been meaning to do for months. A piece of deep gray that she had found in the sewing box and which turned out to match almost exactly. It was not a complicated alteration, but it changed the fit entirely, gave her room where the dress had pulled, made it hers in a way the original version never quite had been. She did it in the evenings while Cassian was across the room with his records, and he didn't ask about it, and she didn't explain it. The morning of the gathering, she put it on and looked in the tin mirror and thought, "This is what I look like." Same as before. Not a performance, not an armor, just herself, in better-fitting clothes, about to walk into a room full of people who had already formed opinions about her. She went downstairs. Cassian was at the table. He looked up when she came in, and something in his expression shifted, briefly, quickly, in that way he had of showing something before the steadiness came back over it. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, because he was not a man who said things for the sake of saying them. They drove into Iron Hollow under a thin February sun that gave light without warmth, and she sat beside him on the bench and watched the valley open up the way it always did as you came down from the ridge, wide and pale and still under the winter sky. The gathering was fuller than the December one had been. February brought people out of their cabins and farmhouses with a particular cabin fever energy. Even the cold was not enough to keep everyone away from the social warmth of a crowded room and a long table of food. Rowan recognized more faces now than she had in December, which was its own strange progress. She knew names. She had learned them from Cassian's descriptions, from Gus's running commentary on Iron Hollow's social landscape, from the way certain people had nodded to her in the street during the brief winter trips into town for supplies. She went in beside Cassian, and she kept her bearing level and her eyes clear, and she did not look for Harriet Voss or Delia Marsh. She let herself be greeted by the people who greeted her. There were more of them than she expected, which suggested that December's scene had done something to the social calculation, redistributed it in some way she did not fully understand. An older woman named Mrs. Haverford, who she knew was one of the valley's longer-established ranch wives, shook her hand with a firm grip and said she'd heard good things about Rowan's kitchen, which under different circumstances might have been condescending, but in Mrs. Haverford's mouth sounded like an actual compliment. For a while the evening was almost manageable, and then Harriet Voss crossed the room toward her. Rowan saw her coming from 20 feet away and felt the shift in her body. The old reflex, the intake of breath, the instinct to make herself smaller and harder to see. She did not follow the instinct. She stood where she was, beside the food table, and waited. Harriet was not alone. Beside her was Delia Marsh, and behind them 2 women Rowan didn't know by name. One older, sharp-faced, wearing a dress that announced money with every seam. One younger, softer-looking, who stayed slightly behind the others in a way that suggested she was here because she had been brought, not because she had chosen to come. "Rowan," Harriet said with the warmth of a woman who had spent 40 years perfecting the texture of it. "How lovely." "Harriet," Rowan said. A small pause, in which both of them understood that December had happened, and that this conversation was taking place in its shadow. "We were just talking," Harriet said, glancing at the woman with the expensive dress in a way that included her and signaled a kind of shared knowledge. "About how things have settled. For you, out at the ranch." "They've settled well," Rowan said. "Of course." Harriet's smile was composed, a thing of craft. "Cassian is a practical man. He makes the best of situations. I've always admired that in him." Situations. The words sat in the air between them. "He is practical," Rowan agreed pleasantly. "We both are." Delia Marsh, standing slightly to Harriet's left, said, in the soft voice of someone introducing a topic they have rehearsed, "It's impressive, really, how you've made a place for yourself, considering the way it all began." "Things begin the way they begin," Rowan said. "What matters is where they go." "Of course," Delia smiled at Harriet. The smile said something that Rowan was not meant to fully read. Some shared understanding, some established view being confirmed. Although one does wonder sometimes whether, given the circumstances, Cassian might have had different expectations for what a wife would bring to the partnership. The word bring landed with precision. It was not about cooking or household management, and everyone in this small circle knew it. It was about standing and family and money and the specific, measurable worth of a woman in a town like this one. Rowan took a breath. She was aware of the gathering around them. Conversations, laughter, the sound of children, all of it continuing uninterrupted. She was aware of being watched, or half-watched, by the people nearest to them, the ones close enough to sense a confrontation, even if they couldn't hear the content. "I think," she said, in a voice she kept very even, that what a wife brings to a partnership is between that wife and her husband. Naturally, said the woman with the expensive dress, speaking for the first time, her voice dry and carrying. But in a community this size, marriages aren't entirely private matters. They affect all of us. A man like Cassian Blackwood has standing here. His choices are his own, Rowan said. They were Dowd's choices first, the woman said. Bluntly, with the particular cruelty of someone who has decided that social veneer is not necessary for this particular target. Let's not pretend otherwise. Dowd found a solution to two problems at once, a rancher without a wife and a family without options. It was an efficient arrangement. No one is saying it wasn't, but efficiency and suitability are not always the same thing. The younger woman behind them had gone very still. Rowan looked at the woman with the expensive dress. She looked at her directly and carefully, the way she had looked at Harriet in December. The clear, steady look that said, I see exactly what you are doing, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What's your name? Rowan asked. A slight pause. The woman had not expected to be addressed directly. Cornelia Draper, she said. Mrs. Draper, Rowan said. I know what you're saying. I've heard variations of it my whole life, that I'm too much of certain things and not enough of others, that the circumstances of my marriage reflect something about my value rather than about the circumstances. She paused. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. No one spoke. What did you bring to your marriage? Rowan said. Not what your family had, not what your husband had. You, specifically, what did you bring? Cornelia Draper's chin came up slightly. I'm not asking to humiliate you, Rowan said, and meant it. I'm asking because I think that's the question none of us ask each other, and we probably should. Because when I think about what I've brought to Blackwood Ranch, the work, the management, the daily decisions that keep a household running in winter, I don't find myself lacking. I find myself tired, and I don't think that's the same thing. A long silence. The noise of the gathering pressed around the edges of it. Harriet Voss's composed expression had gone slightly rigid. The careful pleasantness stretched over something less comfortable. Delia Marsh looked at the floor. The younger woman behind them, the soft-faced one who had been brought and not chosen, looked at Rowan with an expression she had not hidden quickly enough. It was a look of recognition, sharp and involuntary, the kind that happened before you could manage it. Rowan looked back at her briefly, gently, and then returned her gaze to Cornelia Draper. I haven't broken anything, Rowan said quietly. I haven't shamed him. I've kept his house and managed his stores and made the place better than it was. And I've done it without apology, which I understand is its own offense in some circles. She picked up her cup. Excuse me, use... She turned and walked toward the far end of the room and found a spot near the wall and stood there, and her heart was beating very fast and her jaw ached from keeping it level. Cassian appeared at her side within 2 minutes. I wasn't watching, he said, which she thought was probably not entirely true. But I could tell from across the room. Is it that obvious? She said. Only to someone paying attention, he said. She looked at him. How much did you hear? None of it, he said. I told you, I wasn't watching. You said you weren't watching. You didn't say you weren't listening. A pause. Something moved through his face. Some of it, he admitted. She turned her eyes back to the room and breathed carefully through her nose. Harriet Voss and Cornelia Draper had moved away, back into the flow of the gathering, and were now in conversation with 2 other women near the windows. Their backs were to Rowan. Whatever signal they were sending, she received it. Are you all right? Cassian asked. I don't know, she said honestly. Ask me when we're out of this room. He stayed beside her for the rest of the evening. He did not hover. She would not have tolerated hovering. But he was simply present, in the particular way he had of being present without making it a demonstration. He talked to people he needed to talk to and always came back. Once, when a man she didn't know stopped him to discuss cattle prices, she stood slightly apart and watched Cassian in conversation, the way he listened before he spoke, the way he did not perform confidence but simply had it, like a quality of the air around him. And she thought about December and January and February and the strange crooked road that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the younger woman behind Cornelia Draper, the one with the look she hadn't hidden. She did not know her name, she did not know her situation, but she knew the look. They drove home in the dark, and for the first part of the drive, neither of them spoke. The sky was clear tonight, and the stars were hard and bright above the valley, and the horses moved steadily through the cold, their breath clouding in the lamplight. After about a mile, Cassian said, "Cornelia Draper." "You know her," Rowan said. "Her husband owns half the land on the east side of the valley," he said. "He and Dowd have done business together." A pause. "I should have told you that before tonight." "You didn't know what tonight would be," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I knew who she was." He was quiet for a moment. "She has opinions about who belongs where in Iron Hollow. She's been forming them for 30 years and she's not interested in revising them." Rowan looked at the dark road ahead. "She said the marriage was Dowd's solution to two problems at once." She felt him go still beside her, the particular stillness that meant he was controlling something. "She's not wrong about the mechanics of it," Rowan said carefully. "But the thing is, the mechanics aren't the whole thing, are they?" It wasn't quite a question. He answered it anyway. "No," he said. "They're not." She turned to look at him. His profile in the dark was angular and set, the jaw she had come to know in its various configurations, working, thinking, managing something he'd rather not be managing. "What is the whole thing?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. She had learned to wait, to not fill his silences before he was ready to fill them himself. "I told Dowd I was looking for a practical arrangement," he said finally. "That was true. I needed someone who could manage the ranch alongside me, someone steady. I didn't say any of that to myself in a romantic way. I wasn't thinking about it romantically." A pause. "But when I met you that first day at the chapel, and I watched you walk down that aisle in a dress that didn't fit, in front of a room full of people looking at you the way they were." He stopped, reconsidered. "You didn't lower your eyes," he said. Rowan said nothing. "Everyone else in that room would have," he said. "Most people in that situation look for somewhere to hide. You didn't. You walked straight to the front of that room and you stood up straight and you didn't give them anything to confirm what they thought they already knew." He was quiet for a moment. I thought, that's a person who knows how to be in a hard place, and I thought that was worth a great deal more than what Dowd told me he was selling." The horses moved steadily. The stars were very bright. Rowan looked back at the road and was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was careful. "You're telling me you chose me," she said. "As much as anyone chooses anything in these arrangements," he said. "Yes." She thought about that. She thought about the chapel and the dress and the 200 people and the 16-year-old version of herself who had first heard two girls say she'd be pretty enough if she weren't so heavy, and the 19-year-old version who had stood in the back room of this same chapel and breathed through her nose to keep from falling apart. "No one has ever chosen me before," she said, "for something other than what they needed done." It came out more plainly than she intended. She heard it land in the cold air between them and could not retrieve it. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was low and deliberate. "I know," he said. "I could tell." She swallowed. The road moved under them, and the stars held still, and the night was cold and very clear. And she did not know what to call the thing that was happening in her chest, but she recognized it as something she had not felt before. Something that did not have a ready category in her experience. "I'm still moving carefully," she said, finally, into the dark. "I know," he said again. "You don't have to stop." They came up the ridge road, and the lights of the ranch appeared below them, the small, warm glow of the bunkhouse and the banked fire visible through the kitchen window, and the horses turned toward home with the easy confidence of animals that knew where they were going. Chids. She went upstairs that night and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without undressing. The tin mirror across the room held her dim reflection. A woman in a well-fitting dress, back straight, face quiet. And she looked at herself with something that was not pride exactly, but was close to its practical cousin. She had stood up in that room twice now. She had said true things out loud, at cost, in front of people who had come prepared to diminish her. She had not performed confidence she didn't have. She had just refused to perform the alternative. And Cassian Blackwood had told her, on a dark road under winter stars, that he had chosen her, that he had seen something in her on the worst morning of her life and had decided it was worth something. She did not know what to do with that. She did not trust it entirely. She was honest enough with herself to say that. There were years of contrary evidence behind her, years of learning that being seen clearly was not the same as being seen generously, that attention and kindness were not the same thing. She had built her defenses carefully, and they did not come down for one conversation on a dark road, no matter what had been said or how it had been said. But she could feel the shape of something shifting, the way ice shifts in late winter, not breaking, not yet, but moving, changing its orientation to the light. She got up and went to the washstand and cleaned her face and hands, and then stood at the window and looked out at the dark pasture, the frost reforming on the grass now that the temperature was dropping again, the sky above the hills very clear and very cold. She thought about the young woman at the gathering, the one with the look she hadn't hidden. She thought about herself at 12, at 15, at 19 in a chapel. She thought about Cornelia Draper saying efficiency and suitability are not always the same thing, and about the clean, steady anger that had moved through her when those words landed. Not the hot, uncontrolled anger that made you reckless. The cold, clear kind. The kind that knew exactly where it was going. She was not done with Iron Hollow. Iron Hollow was not done with her. But something had changed tonight, in ways she would need time to understand. She had gone into that room afraid, and come out of it different. Not unafraid, nothing so clean as that, but standing in a different relationship to the fear. Like she had stopped waiting for the world's permission to occupy space in it. She let the curtain fall and went to bed. Outside, the February cold pressed at the glass, and the frost spread its white fingers across the pasture in the dark. And the ranch was quiet around her. The particular quiet of a place where things were growing, even under the frozen ground, even when you couldn't yet see the evidence of it. She lay in the dark and let herself, for the first time, consider the possibility that she might actually be all right here. That this life which she had not chosen and had not wanted, and had walked into like a condemned woman walking into winter, might be. Not what she would have picked, maybe, but not without its own worth. She was still considering it when she fell asleep. She did not dream. But 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when the sky had just begun to show the first hesitant suggestion that something other than winter might one day be possible, a certain quality of light in the east, a slight softening in the air that wasn't quite warmth but wasn't entirely its absence, Rowan came downstairs to find a letter on the kitchen table. It was not addressed to her, it was addressed to Cassian, but it had been opened, and he had left it on the table, and when he came in from the barn, he saw her eyes on it and said nothing for a moment. "From Dowd," he said. She looked at him. "He's asking about a second arrangement," Cassian said. He said it flatly, without inflection, the way he said things when the inflection would give away more than he wanted to give away. "Someone else. He seems to think I would be a reference for his work." The room was quiet. Outside, a bird called. The first one she had heard in weeks, some small, determined creature trying out a sound before the season had properly agreed to support it. "What are you going to say?" Rowan asked. Cassian picked up the letter and looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back on the table. "I'm going to tell him no," he said, "and I'm going to tell him why." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. "All right," she said. "And then," he said more carefully, "I'd like to talk about something. When you have time." She looked at his face and tried to read it and found for once that she couldn't. "I have time now," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And in the kitchen of Blackwood Ranch on a Tuesday morning in late February, with the first uncertain bird singing outside and the frost still heavy on the ground, Cassian Blackwood looked at his wife and began to tell her something she had not known he had been working up to say. He sat across from her with his hands flat on the table, not fidgeting, not reaching for his coffee. Just his hands, still and deliberate, the way a man arranges himself when he is about to say something he has thought about for a long time and does not want to get wrong. Rowan waited. She had learned to wait for him, to give his silences the room they needed. She sat with her own hands wrapped around her cup and watched his face and felt the particular quality of this quiet. Heavier than the usual morning quiet, more loaded, the kind that preceded something. "I want to tell you how this started," Cassian said. "From my side, all of it." She nodded once. "Go ahead." He looked at the table for a moment. 2 years ago, I was managing this ranch alone. It wasn't a complaint. I want to be clear about that. I chose to take it on. But there's a size to this place that one person can't fully manage and still do everything else that needs doing. The books, the decisions, the relationships with suppliers, with the bank. It accumulates. He paused. I told myself it was a practical problem. A household needs two people to run properly. A ranch this size especially. You told yourself, she said. Yes. He looked up at her. I was careful about the telling myself. There was someone before, a few years back. Someone I thought understood what this life was, and it turned out she understood it fine, but didn't want it. His voice was level, but she heard the thing underneath it. Old and finished, but still there. The way old wounds are still there, even when they've healed. So I had decided I would be practical about it. No more. I wasn't going to build something out of hope and see it fall apart again. So you went to Dowd, she said. I didn't go to him. He came to me. He'd heard I was in the market, which I hadn't told anyone, so I don't know how he heard it. A pause. That should have told me something about him, that he knew things people hadn't said out loud. She thought about Dowd at her mother's door, the low voice, the careful words, the arrangement that worked for everyone. She thought about how he had known about their debt, specific numbers, specific amounts, without being told. He knew about our farm, she said, what we owed. He knew before he knocked on the door. Cassian's jaw tightened. I know. I put that together later. He makes it his business to know who's in trouble before they know how much trouble they're in. It's how he operates. He gets there when you're desperate enough to say yes and not desperate enough to be suspicious. And we were both exactly there, she said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I told him what I needed, a practical arrangement, someone who could run a house, who wasn't fragile, who understood that frontier life was not what the novels said it was. Someone steady. He paused. Dowd said he had exactly the right person. He said she was practical, capable, and that she understood the nature of the arrangement. A small silence. He said she was willing. The word fell between them the way it had been falling between them since January, when she had told him the truth on a cold morning in this same kitchen. She was willing. The lie that had started everything. When I saw you at the chapel, Cassian continued, something didn't fit. You weren't the way someone is when they've accepted something. You were the way someone is when they're surviving something. There's a difference, and I know what it looks like. He stopped. But I told myself I was reading too much into it, that nerves could look like a lot of things, that I shouldn't assume. You assumed the charitable version, she said, not accusingly, just naming it. I did, he said, because it was more comfortable than the alternative. He looked at his hands. That was wrong of me. You couldn't have known for certain, she said. I could have asked, he said, directly, before we were standing at an altar. His voice was flat with self-reproach. I didn't ask because I was afraid of what the answer might mean for my practical arrangement, and that was a failure of decency on my part that I want to say out loud. The kitchen was very quiet. The bird outside had started up again, still tentative, still testing the air. You're saying this now, she said carefully. Yes. Why now? She turned the cup in her hands. We've been here for months. You could have said any of this in January when I told you what actually happened. You said you were sorry and that you should have asked more questions. That was it. I know. He looked at her. In January, I was still figuring out where the lines were, what you'd take as an intrusion. You don't welcome people inside your thinking easily. You watch for exits. I was aware of that, and I didn't want to crowd you. She opened her mouth and then closed it. He was right, and they both knew he was right. And being accurately described by another person was its own particular discomfort. And now, she said, now I have something I want to say, and I think you've been here long enough to hear it without... He stopped. I want to say it before things happen that make it complicated. She looked at him. What things? He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a folded piece of paper and set it on the table between them. He did not unfold it. He just left it there. That's a letter to the land registry office in Helena, he said. I wrote it last week. It transfers the title of the South Pasture, 60 acres, water rights from the creek included, into your name. Separate from mine. Your property, your decision, your deed. Rowan stared at the folded paper. She did not touch it. Cassian, she said. Let me finish, he said. I've been running over this for a while and I want to get through it. She was quiet. When I married you, he said, I had practical reasons. I've told you what they were, but I also want to tell you that somewhere in the middle of these months, I'm not going to put a date on it, I don't know when, I stopped thinking about this practically. He was looking at her directly now, not managing his expression, not running the steady control she was used to from him. I started thinking about it as something else, something that doesn't have a practical name. She felt the grip in her throat again, the one from Christmas morning with the book. She held it down. You're careful, he said. You should be careful. You have good reasons. I'm not asking you to stop being careful, but I want you to know that what you've built here, what we've built, I suppose, is not something I take as ordinary. The house? Yes. The management? Yes. But also, he paused, and she saw him search for the word, genuinely search, not performing the search. Also the evenings, the books, the notes in the margins, watching you name things, watching you figure out where the exits are in a room and then decide not to use them anyway. He stopped. I'm not indifferent to you, Rowan. I want to say that plainly because I've been indirect about it for months, and I don't think that's done either of us any good. She looked at the folded letter on the table. The land, she said. What does that mean, if I take it? It means you have something that's yours regardless of what happens, he said. Whether you stay or go. Whether this... He gestured slightly between them, a brief, unguarded motion. Whether this becomes something, or whether you decide it's not what you want. I don't want you here because you have nowhere else to go. That's not... He stopped. That's not a life. Rowan set down her cup very carefully. Her hands were steady. She was making them steady, which was different. You're giving me a way out, she said. I'm giving you a choice, he said, which is what you should have had from the beginning and didn't. She looked at him across the table. This man she had not chosen and had not wanted, and had spent 3.5 months learning in the slow, reluctant way of someone who had been wrong about something and was not yet ready to admit it. She looked at his face, the angular jaw, the careful eyes, the particular quality of stillness that she had once read as coldness, and now read as restraint, the restraint of a person who felt things and had learned to be judicious about when he let it show. I need to think, she said. Take whatever time you need, he said. I'm not saying no, she said quickly, because she saw something move across his face, and she didn't want it to move that way. I'm saying I need to think. There's a difference. He looked at her. Something settled in him. All right, he said. She pushed back her chair and stood and picked up her cup and then stood there for a moment, holding it, not quite sure what she had meant to do next. Cassian, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said, for saying the true thing out loud. He held her gaze. You taught me that, he said. I'm returning the favor. She went to the window. She stood there with her back to him and looked out at the pasture where the frost was beginning to lose its grip in the morning light. And she heard him get up and go to the mudroom and put on his coat and go out, leaving her to her thinking the way a person does when they understand that the other person needs space and that giving it to them is more important than staying. Oh. She thought all morning. She went through the motions of the day's work, bread which her hands could do without her brain's full participation, the pantry inventory she'd been meaning to finish, the mending pile that never entirely emptied, and she let her mind move through what he had said, the way you move through a house in the dark, feeling the walls, mapping the space. She thought about the land, 60 acres, water rights, her name on a deed, separate and inviolable, a thing that could not be taken back even if everything else unraveled. She had lived her whole life in the knowledge that women in her situation, the situation of poverty, of dependency, of having been traded between one set of inadequate circumstances and another, were one decision away from having nothing. The land was an answer to that, a specific, concrete answer to a fear she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight. She thought about what it meant that he had thought to do it. Not as a gesture of charity, she had turned that interpretation over and set it down, because it didn't fit with what she knew of him. He didn't do charity, he did fairness. The distinction, which he had offered her on the very first wagon ride, remained consistent. This was fairness. You should have had a choice from the beginning, giving her one now, retroactively, in the only form he could. She thought about moving carefully. She thought about all the reasons she had been right to move carefully and all the evidence she had accumulated over 4 months and what that evidence added up to. She thought about the girl behind Cornelia Draper at the February gathering, the one with the look. And she thought about herself at 12 and herself in the chapel and herself standing in the December gathering with shaking hands saying true things out loud, and herself on a dark road under winter stars listening to a man say you didn't lower your eyes. She thought about the notes in the margins. Most honest thing I've read in a while. You know exactly what you mean even when I don't know how to. She thought about Christmas morning and a book with her name on it in his slightly tilted handwriting. She thought about Gus half a pound heavier and Peter's single nod that meant everything, and the storm in December and the kitchen crowded with cold men, and how she had not minded any of it. How she had found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind it. By mid-morning, she had stopped pretending she was thinking and started admitting that she had already arrived somewhere and was taking her time acknowledging it. She was afraid. She could be honest about that. She was afraid in the specific way of a person who has been burned and is standing near fire again. Not because the fire is the same fire, but because fire is fire, and the body remembers. She was afraid of being wrong, of having assembled the evidence incorrectly, of discovering 6 months from now that what she had read as decency and genuine attention was in fact something more ordinary and more disappointing. She was afraid of having let herself want something and then losing it. But she was also 20 years old, and she had spent 8 years being afraid of one thing or another. And she was beginning to understand that the fear did not go away when you avoided the thing. It just found a different shape. At noon, she made lunch and left a portion covered on the stove and ate her own at the table, alone, and read 3 pages of the novel that had been on her nightstand for a week without registering any of them. Then she set the book down and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. She thought about her mother, about the ledger book with the numbers in shaking handwriting, about her brothers, thin-armed and frightened, about the specific concrete fact that the money she had sent home at Christmas had arrived and had been received, and that her mother's last letter had been written in a slightly different tone than the ones before it. Still careful, still managing, but with something in it that was not quite despair. She thought about what the South pasture represented, and she thought about what she would do with 60 acres and water rights if they were hers. She would plant something. That was the first thing she thought. Not because it was romantic, but because she was a person who understood land as something you worked, and she would work it. Orchards, maybe. She had been reading about apple varieties in the almanac, the ones suited to this elevation and climate. And there was a section of the South pasture that got full morning sun and was sheltered from the worst of the north wind by the ridge. She had noticed it in January. She had noticed it and then told herself firmly to stop noticing things as though they were hers. They could be hers. The thought arrived with a solidity that surprised her. Not might be. Could be. Right now, today, if she chose it. She got up from the table and went to the mudroom and put on her coat and her boots and went outside. Cassian was in the barn. She heard him before she saw him. The low, steady sound of him talking to one of the horses, the particular cadence of a person who talks to animals without embarrassment, which she had found was one of the more reliable indicators of a person's actual character. You could perform a lot of things for an audience. You did not perform for horses. She pushed the barn door open and the smell of hay and horses and cold leather met her, and she stood in the doorway for a moment while her eyes adjusted. He was at the far stall, brushing down the bay mare he favored, a steady, level-headed animal named something she still didn't know because he referred to her only as the bay. He turned when he heard the door. She walked down the center of the barn to where he was standing and stopped about 4 feet away, which was the distance she had maintained from him for 4 months, the careful, measured space of a person who was still mapping exits. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. He had set down the brush. He was watching her with that full attention, the kind that did not hedge. "I'm scared," she said. She said it flatly, without apology, because she was done managing the presentation of herself for other people's comfort. "I want to say that first. I'm not being swept away by anything. I know the difference between being swept away and making a decision, and this is a decision." He nodded once, listening. "I've spent 4 months trying to find the thing about you that was going to prove I was right to be suspicious," she said. "I haven't found it, That doesn't mean it isn't there, but at some point you have to make a decision with the evidence you have, or you never make any decisions at all. He was very still. I don't want the land, she said. His face shifted. I mean, I want it, she said quickly. The offer is, I understand what it means, and it matters to me that you did it, but I don't want it as a way out. I don't want a way out. She stopped, breathed. I've been preparing for the exit since the day I arrived, keeping something back, keeping my own space inside myself, in case I needed to leave quickly. It was the right instinct, maybe, given how I got here, but it's not. She stopped again, looking for the word. It's not how I want to live. Not if I don't have to. The bay mare shifted beside them, blowing softly. If you're saying you want to stay, Cassian said carefully, I need you to be saying that because you want to stay, not because you think, I know what you're going to say, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I know. That's why I started with the fear, because if it were about having nowhere to go, I wouldn't be afraid. There'd be nothing to lose. She looked at him directly. I'm afraid because there's something to lose. That's different. He was quiet for a long moment. The barn settled around them, the particular creak of old wood, the patient sounds of the horses. Then take the land, he said. Not as a way out. Take it because it should be yours. Because you've earned it, and because you should have something in your name that no circumstance can revoke. He paused. And stay because you want to. She looked at him. Those don't have to be in conflict, he said. She thought about it. He was right, and she recognized it as right. And she recognized further that this was one of the things about him that she had been adding to her accumulation of evidence without letting herself name it. The way he consistently refused to frame things as either or when they didn't have to be. All right, she said. All right, he said. I'll take the land, she said. And I'll stay, because I want to. She paused. Those are two separate sentences. Something changed in his face. Not a dramatic change. He was not a dramatic man, but something loosened, some held tension that she hadn't realized he'd been carrying. They can be separate sentences, he said. That's fine by me. She took one step forward, closed the distance from 4 feet to 2, which was as much as she had and as much as she was prepared to give right now, and she stood there looking at him at close range, at the face she had been studying for 4 months, at the jaw and the careful eyes and the quality of stillness that was not coldness, had never been coldness. And she said, I want you to know that I see you clearly. This isn't because I've decided to be grateful. I'm not a person who confuses gratitude with something else. I see you clearly, and I'm still choosing this. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, I know. That's the point. She almost smiled. Almost. I'm still moving carefully, she said. I know, he said. So am I. She turned and walked back through the barn, and the cold air met her at the door. And she stood for a moment on the threshold with the pale, late February sun on her face and the barn warm at her back, and she breathed in and breathed out, and she thought, all right then. She sent the letter to her mother that afternoon. Not the one she had been composing in her head for months, the careful, measured one that said everything between the lines. A new one, shorter and more direct. She told her mother that she was well, that the ranch was good work and she was doing it, that she had made something here, or was making it, which was perhaps not so different. She told her mother that there was land coming to her name, legal and registered, which she wanted her to know because it meant she would not be without resource. She said she hoped the money had helped. She said she would come to visit when the roads were open in spring, if her mother wanted her to come. She did not say I'm happy, because it was too early for that, and she had never been the kind of person who said things before she was certain of them. But she did say, at the very end, in her small, careful handwriting, I believe it is going to be all right. I am beginning to believe that. She sealed it and set it on the table to go with the next post, and then went back to the kitchen to start supper, because the day was still a day and there was still work to do, and she was still a person who did her work regardless of what else was happening. Gus came to the back door at 5 with a transparently invented question about the flour stores. She let him in and gave him a piece of bread and butter and told him the flour was fine. He sat at the corner of the table eating his bread with the satisfied air of a man who had accomplished his actual objective. You look different, he said, studying her with the particular interest he brought to most things. Different how? She said, not looking up from the onions she was cutting. Settled, he said, like you planted your feet. She said nothing. It's a good look, Gus said. He finished his bread and got up and put his hat on. Good look on you? He went back to the bunkhouse, and she heard him whistling something tuneless on the way, the kind of whistle that indicated general satisfaction with the world, and she shook her head slightly and went back to supper. Tea. That night, after the dishes were done and the fire was banked and the lamps were turned low, Cassian came into the sitting room where she was sewing and set a cup of coffee on the table beside her chair without being asked. Then he sat down across from her with his own cup and opened his records. She looked at the coffee. Then she looked at him. He was already reading, his eyes on the page, his thumb running along the column of figures in the way she had long since memorized. She picked up the coffee and went back to her sewing. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had dropped for the first time in weeks, and the night was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like the land itself was paying attention. She stitched, and he read, and the sitting room held them both in the warm, imperfect way of a room that has been inhabited long enough to know what it is. After a while, without looking up from his records, he said, The Helena registrar will need a witness signature on the deed transfer. I'll need to take it into town by the end of the month. All right, she said. You should come with me, he said. Sign it yourself in front of the registrar. Make it yours properly. She looked up at him then. He was still looking at his records. I will, she said. He nodded once. Went back to his figures. She went back to her sewing. The fire crackled, and the night lay quiet around the house. And somewhere out in the dark pasture, the land that was becoming hers waited under the last of the winter frost, patient and indifferent. The way land is, the way it has always been, not caring who owned it, not caring what was decided or suffered or chosen in the house at its edge. Just there, solid and cold and waiting for the first indication of spring. It would come. It always came. That was the one thing you could count on in Iron Hollow, or anywhere, that the cold had an end, and after the end came the ground, and after the ground came whatever you decided to plant in it. Rowan stitched on in the lamplight, and across the room Cassian turned a page, and between them the silence was not empty but full. Of the day that had just passed, of what had been said in a barn and in a kitchen and on the threshold of a door, of the particular complicated ordinary miracle of two people in a room who have decided, carefully and imperfectly, and without any guarantee, to be there together. It was not a grand thing. It was not supposed to be. It was just a sitting room, and two people, and a fire going down to coals, and outside the last of the winter holding its breath before it let go. The trip to Helena to register the deed took 3 days. Cassian had arranged it for the last week of February, when the roads were still hard frozen enough to travel reliably, but the worst of the winter storms had passed. They left before dawn on a Wednesday. Gus and Peter left to manage the ranch, and drove north through a landscape that was beginning, just barely, to show the first signs of surrender. Patches where the snow had pulled back from south-facing slopes. The creek ice running thin at the edges, a quality of light in the mornings that had more intention to it than the flat gray of deep winter. Rowan sat on the wagon bench beside Cassian and watched the valley open up as they climbed out of the Iron Hollow basin, and she felt something she recognized after a moment as anticipation. Not dread, not the braced, shoulders-up feeling she had carried for so many months, something lighter and more forward-looking. They talked through the first morning's drive in the easy, intermittent way they had developed over winter. Subjects picked up and set down, silences that were restful rather than weighted. He told her about Helena, which he knew from 3 previous trips for land and banking business. She told him about the apple varieties she had been reading about in the almanac, the ones suited to the South Pasture's conditions. He listened with the quality of attention she had come to rely on, not just waiting for her to finish, but actually tracking what she said, occasionally asking a question that showed he had been listening to the part underneath the words too. You've been planning it for a while, he said. The orchard. I've been thinking about it, she said carefully. Planning implies I had permission. You didn't need my permission, he said. I know that now, she said. I didn't know it in January. He glanced at her. What changed? She considered this honestly. I stopped thinking of myself as temporary, she said, somewhere around February. I'm not sure exactly when. He looked back at the road. After a moment he said, "Good," and meant so much more than the word, and she understood all of it. They stopped overnight at a way station, a working inn that smelled of smoke and boiled meat and horses, and she slept in a small room with a thin mattress and was perfectly comfortable because she had long since stopped requiring comfort to be at ease. Cassian was down the hall and knocked on her door in the morning with coffee from the innkeeper's pot, already black and strong the way she now took it, having picked up his preference somewhere in the winter months without noticing. Helena was larger and louder than Iron Hollow in every way. The noise of it, the traffic on the main streets, the way sound bounced off buildings that were pressed close together rather than spread across a valley floor. Rowan watched it with the focused attention she brought to new things, cataloging and filing, and noticed that she did not feel small in it. She had expected to. She had expected the city, even this modest frontier city, to remind her of her own smallness, the way crowds usually did. Instead, she walked beside Cassian through the main street and felt entirely like herself, which was something she had not felt in a public place, surrounded by people, for as long as she could remember. The land registry office was a square government building with a clerk behind a high counter who reviewed Cassian's papers with the thoroughness of a man who took bureaucratic precision seriously. He asked Rowan directly whether she understood the nature of the transfer, whether she was acting freely and without coercion, whether she wished to hold the title in her own name. She answered each question plainly and directly, looking at him without flinching. "Yes," she said to the last one, "my name, Rowan Mercer Blackwood." She had not planned to add Blackwood. It came out that way naturally, before she had finished deciding on it, and she recognized as she said it that some decisions happen in the speaking rather than before it. The clerk wrote it down without comment. Cassian, standing beside her, said nothing. But she felt, without looking at him, the particular stillness of a person who has just received something he had not expected and does not want to disturb. She signed where the clerk indicated. The pen scratched across the paper and left her name in her own handwriting, and the clerk stamped it twice and filed one copy and handed her the other, folded and tied with a piece of red cord, and she held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Her name. On a piece of paper that said the land was hers. She put it carefully inside her coat, against her chest, and they walked back out into the Helena morning. On the drive home, she held the deed inside her coat the first hour without realizing she was doing it, her hand pressed flat against it through the wool as though to confirm it was still there. Cassian noticed but said nothing, which she had come to understand was one of his most consistent gifts, the ability to see something clearly and decide that the scene was enough, that he did not need to comment on it too. Iron Hollow received them back on a Friday afternoon with the particular indifference of a small town that has its own concerns. The ranch looked different to her when they came over the ridge road, or rather, it looked the same, but she looked at it differently. The cluster of buildings against the low hills, the smoke from the kitchen chimney, the fence lines running out across the pasture, the south pasture visible from the high point of the road, pale and frostbitten and waiting. Hers. 60 acres of waiting. Gus came out of the barn when he heard the wagon and waved, and Peter was behind him, and the dogs that had attached themselves to the ranch from somewhere were barking, and it was completely ordinary and completely good. March arrived, and with it the first real suggestion of spring, tentative and retreating and advancing again the way spring always did in the valley, as though it had to gather its nerve before committing. The frost pulled back from the south-facing slopes first. The creek ice fractured and ran. There was mud everywhere, the particular relentless mud of a frontier thaw, and Rowan tracked it inside twice before she accepted that the mud season was simply the condition of things for a while, and that fighting it was a waste of energy she needed elsewhere. She was planning the orchard. Properly now, not just in her head. She had a piece of paper on the kitchen table that she returned to in the evenings, marking rows and spacing, and which varieties would go where, referencing the almanac and the botanical catalog Cassian had given her at Christmas. He came and looked over her shoulder sometimes, asking questions, offering observations about the drainage of the south pasture and where the water pooled in heavy rain, information she needed and that he provided without making it a tutorial. It was collaboration, which was different from instruction, and she appreciated the difference. "The east section runs wet in April," he said one evening, leaning over the paper. "You'll want to start your rows here instead." He pointed to a spot on her rough sketch, "and run them north-south rather than east-west." That changes the spacing, she said. Some of it. She looked at the sketch. Show me. He pulled the paper toward him and marked it with light pencil lines, and she watched his hand move across the paper. The same hand she'd watched press against his jaw when he was thinking. The same hand that had written most honest thing I've read in a while in a book margin in January. And she thought that this, exactly this, was what she had not known to want. Not the grand declarations, not the romantic gestures, just a man leaning over a table helping her figure out where to plant her trees. She was learning that the things you did not know to want were sometimes the most important things. The March gathering was on the second Sunday of the month, and Rowan went to it the way she now went to everything in Iron Hollow, as herself, without additional preparation, without the bracing, not without awareness. She was never without awareness, but the quality of it had changed. She was not walking into rooms anymore, expecting them to diminish her. She was walking into rooms expecting to exist in them. Cassian came with her, as he always did now, and they drove into town in the early morning light and tied the horses at the post outside the chapel and went in together. She had stopped noticing, somewhere in the past few weeks, that she had stopped monitoring the exits. The room was as it always was. The low noise of a community gathering, children underfoot, food on the long table, men near the door. She greeted the people she knew now by name, which was more people than she would have imagined possible in October. Mrs. Haverford shook her hand with the same firm grip. A woman named Lucia, whose husband ran the feed store, stopped her to ask whether the apple trees she'd heard about would produce within the season, which told Rowan that the orchard was already known in town, that it had traveled the way everything in Iron Hollow traveled, by some process of social osmosis she had never fully understood. She was explaining espalier training to Lucia when she saw, across the room, the young woman from the February gathering. She was standing near the windows, holding a cup with both hands in a way that Rowan recognized. The way you hold something when you need your hands occupied, when standing alone in a crowded room has become a management problem. The young woman was perhaps 22 or 23, brown-haired, with a careful, composed expression that Rowan had learned to read as the expression of a person who was working hard at it. Rowan excused herself from Lucia and crossed the room. "I don't know your name," she said, stopping beside the woman. "I realized I never asked." The woman looked at her with a flash of something, surprise quickly managed, and then said, "Ada. Ada Whitmore." "Rowan Blackwood," Rowan said. A small silence. Ada Whitmore's eyes moved over her face with an evaluating quality that Rowan recognized as self-protective, looking for whether this was safe, whether the approach was genuine, whether there was something behind it she should be guarding against. "I saw you," Rowan said. "In February, when Cornelia Draper was—" She paused, choosing her words. "When she was saying what she was saying." Ada looked at her cup. "You had a look on your face," Rowan said. "I recognized it." A pause. "Recognized it how?" Ada said, very quietly. "Because I'd worn it," Rowan said. Ada was quiet for a moment. Around them, the gathering moved and talked and paid them no particular attention. "My husband and Cornelia Draper's husband do business together," Ada said, eventually. "She has opinions about what that means for the wives. What's appropriate. What we should and shouldn't say." She stopped. "I'm not like you," she said. And it came out as a statement rather than a judgment, the observation of someone noting a fact. I'm not going to stand up in the middle of a room." "You don't have to," Rowan said. "That's not the only way." Ada looked at her. "Then what's the way?" Rowan thought about the kitchen in January and the barn in February, and a piece of paper with her name on it pressed against her chest in a registry office in Helena. She thought about the note in the margin of a battered book, and a bird singing before spring had agreed to it, and the look on Cassian's face on a dark road when she told him she had not lowered her eyes. "You decide what's yours," she said simply. "Whatever it is. And you stop apologizing for it." Ada looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked away, out of the window, at the gray March morning and the mud-brown street of Iron Hollow. Something moved across her face that was not quite resolution, but was its forerunner, the look of a person turning something over, finding the angle of it. "That sounds easier than it is," Ada said. "Yes," Rowan said, "it is." She did not say anything else encouraging or elaborate, because she had learned that encouragement given in excess of what was asked for was its own kind of condescension. She just stood beside Ada Whitmore at the window for a few minutes, two women in a crowded room, and let the quiet be what it was. When she moved away, she felt Cassian's eyes from across the room and glanced at him, and he raised his chin very slightly. Not approval exactly, just acknowledgement, the particular signal of a person who has seen something and wants to say so without making it a production. She held his gaze for a moment, and then went to get more coffee. The matter of Elias Dowd resolved itself on a Tuesday in late March, in a way she had not anticipated. Cassian had sent his refusal by post in February, as he said he would, a short, direct letter declining to serve as a reference and stating his reasons plainly, which she knew because he had shown it to her before he sent it. She had read it carefully and said it was fine and meant it. He had sent it, and she had considered the matter handled, or at least finished. But Dowd came to the ranch. He appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when Cassian was in the south pasture with Gus and Peter, starting the first fence repairs of the season. Rowan heard the horse on the ridge road and came to the kitchen window and looked out, and did not recognize the man, but she recognized the type, the particular, well-maintained appearance of a man who traveled for business, who had learned that looking presentable opened doors. She went to the back door and waited. He was perhaps 50, with a trimmed beard going to gray, and he carried his hat in one hand as he approached, which was meant to signal harmlessness. She recognized the gesture as calculated. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, stopping at the foot of the back step. "I'm Elias Dowd. I believe your husband—" "I know who you are," she said. He paused. His eyes moved over her face with a professional assessment that she felt like a hand on her shoulder, proprietary and presuming. "Then you know I'd like to speak with Mr. Blackwood, if he's available." "He's not," she said. "I'm available." Dowd looked at her with the particular expression of a man recalibrating. She watched him do it without helping him. He put his hat back on, not out of rudeness, but out of the habit of a man who thought better when his hands weren't occupied with something. "I received his letter," Dowd said. "I thought perhaps a conversation might clarify some—" "His letter was clear," Rowan said. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand there may have been some—" He paused, selecting his word. "Some confusion about the nature of my work. I match people to situations. It's a practical service. The Blackwood arrangement has been—" "The arrangement," she said, "was built on a lie you told my husband and a coercion you applied to my family. You knew what our circumstances were and you used them. You told Cassian I had agreed to this willingly. I hadn't been asked." Dowd's expression shifted to something that was not quite remorse but was performing in its direction. "I may have been optimistic about certain details." "You lied," she said. "Don't call it optimism." He was quiet. She watched him calculate. What was salvageable here? What was not? What approach might still get him what he'd come for? "My husband told you no," she said. "I'm telling you no. Those are two separate no's from two separate people who have discussed this and agree. I'd suggest you treat that as settled." Dowd looked at her for a moment. He was not a stupid man, she thought. He was simply a man who had grown accustomed to working with people who had fewer options than he did, and he was adjusting, slowly, to a situation where that leverage did not apply. "I see," he said. "I hope so," she said pleasantly. "I'd hate for there to be a third conversation." He put his hat on properly, settled it, and turned and went back to his horse. She watched him ride away down the ridge road and felt nothing dramatic about it. No great triumph, no particular relief, just the clean, factual sense of something finished. He was a small, self-interested man who had done real harm and would probably do more of it to other people in other valleys, and she could not fix that. But she could fix this particular instance of it, and she had. She went back inside and put the kettle on. When Cassian came in that evening, she told him what had happened, plainly and completely, the way she told him things now. He stood in the mudroom taking off his boots and listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You didn't send for me," he said. "I didn't need you," she said. "Did that bother you?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "It didn't." And she believed him, which was also something she had learned, that she could believe him, that his stated feelings were his actual feelings, that she did not need to look for the version behind the version. That was rarer than it should have been. and she did not take it for granted. But April came in with its particular chaos. The mud and the new growth arriving simultaneously, the pasture going from frost gray to a tentative scrubby green over the course of 2 weeks, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt, the days stretching out at both ends as the light returned to the valley. Gus declared every morning that it was a fine day, even on the ones that clearly weren't, and Peter continued to communicate in nods and minimal words, and the occasional gesture that was, she had come to understand, his fullest range of expression and no less meaningful for it. She planted the orchard in the second week of April. She had ordered the saplings from a nursery in Missoula by post in March. 18 trees, a mix of the apple varieties the almanac had recommended for the elevation, plus 2 pear trees that she had added at the last minute because there had been a pear tree at the edge of her family's farm that she had climbed as a child. And some decisions were practical and some were not. The saplings arrived wrapped in damp burlap, bare-rooted, not much to look at, the kind of thing that required an act of faith to put in the ground. She had been out in the south pasture since early morning, marking the row lines with string and stakes, working from the sketch she and Cassian had revised together over the kitchen table. The ground was workable now, still heavy and wet, but yielding to the shovel, not frozen through anymore. She had been digging for 2 hours when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Cassian there with a second shovel over his shoulder, not asking, just arriving. "You have fence to repair," she said. "Gus has fence to repair," he said. "I have an orchard to plant." She looked at him for a moment, then turned back to her work. He started on the next hole down the row without further comment, and they worked in the particular productive quiet of people who have learned each other's rhythm. She staked and measured, and he dug, and then they switched, and the morning moved around them. At noon, Gus appeared at the pasture gate with a bundled lunch that he set on the fence post without comment and retreated, which was Gus expressing something through action because he knew it wouldn't come out right in words. They sat in the new grass at the edge of the south pasture and ate, and the valley spread out below them in the April sun. The creek a silver line in the distance, the rooftops of Iron Hollow just visible at the far end, the hills on all sides wearing their new green tentatively, as though not yet sure they'd committed to the season. "My father planted a kitchen garden every spring," Cassian said, unwrapping a piece of bread. "Right up until the spring he got sick. He'd be out in March before the ground was properly ready, just turning the soil over. Couldn't wait." She looked at him. He did not often speak about his father. "What was he like?" she asked. "Stubborn," he said. "Wrong sometimes, wouldn't admit it. Worked harder than any man on the property." He paused. "He would have liked you." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" He looked at her. "Because you don't flinch," he said. He had no patience for flinching. She turned to look back at the row of newly dug holes, at the small burlap-wrapped saplings lined up beside them, waiting to go in. 18 trees. In 5 years they would be bearing. In 10 they would be substantial. She would be 30 years old in 10 years, and the orchard would be producing, and she could not quite hold the thought fully. It was too large, too forward-looking, a kind of hope she was still learning to carry without dropping. "I never thought past the next problem," she said, "for most of my life. Whatever crisis was in front of me was the whole world. There wasn't space to think about 10 years. "And now?" he said. She looked at the holes in the ground, at the place where the trees would go. "Now I'm thinking about 10 years, she said. He was quiet beside her. The valley lay open around them, wide and pale and green-edged, and the sky above it was the particular blue of an April morning that has decided to be fully itself. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. She had been turning this over for weeks, in the way she turned over all the things she said to him, testing them for truth, making sure they were hers and not just things she thought she was supposed to say. She had found that it was true, that it had been true for a while, and that she had simply been waiting for the right moment, and had finally understood that there was no right moment, and that you had to choose the moment yourself, or it never came. "I love you," she said, simply, plainly, looking at him directly. "I want to say it out loud because you said the true thing out loud in February, and I should have said this one sooner." He held her gaze. Something moved across his face, something that was not the controlled, managed expression she was used to from him, something more open and more honest, the face of a man who was not performing anything at all. "Rowan," he said. You don't have to match it right now, she said quickly. I'm not saying it to get something back. I'm saying it because it's true, and I spent enough of my life not saying true things, and I'm done with that. I know, he said. I know that's why you're saying it. He paused. I'm saying your name because I need a second. She waited. I've been in love with you since January, he said. Approximately since the night of the December storm, if I'm being precise. When you fed 4 people out of whatever you could put together and made it look like you'd planned it all week. He looked at her steadily. I didn't say it because I thought if I said it too soon, you'd run. She looked at him for a long moment. I might have, she said honestly. I know, he said. She turned back to the orchard holes and the waiting saplings and the April sky, and she sat for a moment in the simple, enormous weight of 2 people who have told each other the truth, not the performed truth, not the presentable version, the actual thing. We should finish planting, she said. We should, he said. They got up and went back to work, and the afternoon moved around them in the south pasture of Blackwood Ranch, on land that had her name on it, and the saplings went into the cold, dark ground one by one, and neither of them said anything more about what had just been said because it didn't need elaboration. It just needed to exist, which it now did. The Sunday gathering in late April was the one that Iron Hollow remembered for years afterward, though not for any of the reasons that Sunday gatherings were usually remembered. Rowan had not planned it. She had gone to the gathering as she always went now, as herself. The dark blue wool dress, the hair pinned back with combs that now stayed where she put them because she had finally replaced the wooden ones with proper ones. Cassian beside her, the familiar noise of the assembled community, the food table, the children. She had been talking to Lucia about the orchard, and Lucia had been asking about purchasing fruit once the trees were bearing, and it had been an ordinary, pleasant conversation when Cornelia Draper's voice cut across the room, not directed at Rowan specifically, but in the way certain voices carry in certain rooms, landing on everyone at once. The Blackwood arrangement, Cornelia was saying to the woman beside her, with the brisk satisfaction of someone summarizing a known quantity. A practical solution. I'll grant you Cassian made the best of it, but you can hardly call it, well, certain things begin a certain way, and that's simply the fact of them. The room did not stop, but it slowed slightly in the way it did when something worth listening to was happening. Rowan looked at Cassian. He looked back at her, and in his expression she read the question, Do you want this? Not shall I... He was not the kind of man who moved without being invited. But do you want this, which was different? She turned to face the room. Mrs. Draper, she said in a voice that carried clearly without being raised. I wonder if you'd say what you just said out loud, to everyone. Cornelia Draper turned. Her expression moved through several things quickly. Irritation, calculation, the recovery of composure. I was simply saying, she began. I heard what you were saying, Rowan said. I'm asking you to say it to my face. The room had gone genuinely quiet now, not the partial quiet of people trying to listen while pretending not to. The complete quiet of people who have decided that this is the thing happening and they are not going to miss it. Cassian stepped forward to stand beside Rowan, not in front of her, beside her. My wife asked you a question, he said, in the particular level voice he used when he was not going to repeat himself. Cornelia Draper looked at both of them. Her composure was still there. She was not a woman who lost composure easily, which Rowan had come to understand as both her strength and her limitation. But something behind it had shifted. I was simply acknowledging the circumstances of your marriage, Cornelia said. Cooler now, more precise. That's not an attack, it's a fact. The circumstances of my marriage, Rowan said, are that I am standing in this room with a deed in my name to 60 acres of valley land and water rights from the creek, and that man beside me put it there because he believed I should have something that was mine regardless of what anyone in this town decided to say about me. She paused. That's a fact too. The silence was different now. She could feel its texture. Surprise, yes, but underneath the surprise something else. The particular weight of a community recalculating. I was brought here under circumstances I didn't choose, Rowan continued. I've said that out loud before in this room, and I'll say it again because I'm not ashamed of it. My family was in debt. There were no good options. Someone made a decision for me that I should have been asked to make myself. She looked around the room, not at Cornelia specifically, but at all of it, the full assembled weight of Iron Hollow's opinion. I walked into this valley with nothing I had chosen and everything I had built. You decided what I was before I opened my mouth. You measured me by what you could see and decided the rest. She stopped, breathed. I am not asking you to think well of me. I stopped needing that somewhere in January. She paused. I'm telling you that the woman you spent the winter deciding was a convenient arrangement is standing in front of you now with her name on land that she is going to plant into an orchard, and she intends to be here for a very long time, and she is done being a subject of your charity or your pity or your convenient opinions. Cornelia Draper said nothing. No one said anything. Cassian's hand found hers at her side. Not a dramatic gesture, not raised, not displayed, just his hand beside her hand, a quiet and certain thing. She did not need to look at him to know exactly what it meant. The gathering resumed as gatherings do, because life resumes. It always resumes, indifferent to whatever confrontation has just been staged within it. But it resumed differently. She felt the difference in the way people approached her after, the slight but real recalibration in how they stood when they spoke to her, the particular quality of directness that came from people who had just watched something happen and were revising their conclusions. Ada Whitmore found her near the end of the evening, just before the crowd began to thin. She stood beside Rowan for a moment without speaking, in the way she had at the February gathering. Then she said quietly, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" Rowan said. "Talk like none of them can touch you." Rowan looked at her. "They can touch me," she said. "It hurt. It hurt every time. I just stopped believing that the hurting meant they were right." Ada was quiet. "It's the distinction that matters," Rowan said. "Pain and wrongness are not the same thing. Something can be painful and still be wrong." Ada nodded slowly. Something had settled in her face. Not resolution. It was too early for resolution, but the beginning of it, the first hard layer of it. "My husband," Ada said, and then stopped. "You don't have to tell me," Rowan said. "I know," Ada said. "I think I might anyway. Sometime." She looked at Rowan. If you wouldn't mind." "Come to the ranch," Rowan said, "when you want to talk." Ada nodded. She went back to her husband, a solid-faced man across the room, who watched his wife return with eyes that told Rowan a great deal in a short amount of time. She filed it away. They drove home through the April evening, the sky going to rose and then to deep blue above the valley, the first stars appearing while there was still light in the west. The horses moved steadily on the familiar road, and Rowan sat with her hands loose in her lap and felt the particular lightness of a day that had required a great deal and was now finished. "You didn't need me to say anything," Cassian said. It was an observation, not a complaint. "No," she said, "but I was glad you were standing there." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a different thing," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She looked out at the valley settling into its evening colors and thought about the difference between need and want and how she had spent so many years confusing them, collapsing the one into the other because need had been so constant that she had not had space to understand what she actually wanted. She thought about what it meant to stand in a room and speak without needing the room's permission, and how long it had taken her to arrive at that, and how the arriving had not been a single moment but 100 small ones, a kitchen table, a book margin, a cold road, a barn door, a piece of paper with her name on it, 18 saplings in the south pasture. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "You've had the thinking look all evening." "What's the thinking look?" "Your right eyebrow," he said. "It does something." She considered being annoyed at this and decided against it. "I've been thinking about what this year was," she said. "What it actually was, underneath the arrangement and the gathering and all of it. And," he said, "I think it was a woman finding out that the story other people told about her wasn't the true one," she said, "and having to figure out what the true one was, without much help." She paused. "And I think it was a man who had the sense to wait while she did." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure I was always patient," he said. "I wanted to. There were moments I wanted to move faster than was right." "But you didn't," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." "That matters," she said simply. The ranch came into view as they crested the ridge road, the lamplight in the kitchen window, the steady dark shape of the barn, The south pasture out to the left, where 18 small trees were in the ground now, invisible in the dark, beginning the slow work of becoming what they were meant to be. She thought about everything she had come here without. No choice, no preparation, no idea of what she was walking into. She thought about the borrowed dress and the chapel full of spectators, and the woman who had whispered something she thought Rowan couldn't hear, and the specific contained way Cassian had said, "Let's go," and walked her out into the gray morning. She thought about all the things she had thought she was arriving at the end of. She thought about what she had actually been arriving at the beginning of. The truth she had learned was not that the world stopped judging you. It did not. It would not. There would always be a Cornelia Draper, always a Harriet Voss, always a room full of people who had formed their opinions before you walked in and were not particularly interested in revising them. The world had not changed. Iron Hollow had not changed. It had shifted slightly, recalibrated slightly, but it was the same town with the same limitations it had always had. That was simply the fact of it. What had changed was the question she asked when she walked into a room. She had spent years asking, "What do they think of me?" She had spent years bracing for the answer, arranging herself in response to it, moving through the world at an angle shaped by other people's judgments the way a tree shapes itself around a stone. Growing crooked, growing sideways, growing in whatever direction the obstacle permitted. She had stopped asking that question somewhere between December and April, in the slow accumulation of kitchen mornings and barn conversations and book margins and true things said out loud. She had replaced it with a different one, simpler and more difficult. What do I think? What did she think, and what did she want? And what was she willing to stand up for when it cost something to stand? She was still learning the answers. She would be learning them for a long time. She was 20 years old, and there was a great deal of world left, and she was not the kind of person who imagined the learning ever finished. But the orchard was in the ground. Her name was on the deed. There was a man beside her on a wagon bench who had said, "I've been in love with you since January," without flinching, and meant every syllable of it. The ranch received them back with the indifference of a place that has become home. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just the familiar creak of the gate, the dogs coming out to greet the horses, Gus's lamp visible through the bunkhouse window. Rowan climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard for a moment, looking up at the sky, which was fully dark now and crowded with stars, the great indifferent splendor of a clear April night above Iron Hollow. She breathed the cold air, mud and new grass, and the particular clean sharpness of snowmelt still coming off the high peaks. Cassian came around from the horses and stopped beside her, following her gaze upward. They stood there for a moment, looking at the same sky. "Come on," she said finally. "I'll make coffee." "All right," he said. They went inside and the door closed behind them, and the lamp in the kitchen window burned warm against the dark, and the south pasture lay quiet and waiting in the April night. And in the cold black soil, 18 small trees put down their first roots, beginning the long patient work of becoming something that would bear fruit and provide shade and outlast every opinion ever formed about the woman who had planted them.